Thank you, Gary. I would like to say that, as Gary said, that I spent almost 14 years at Tyler Junior College, starting as a controller and then worked my way up to the CFO. And then in 2002, I came down to Austin Community College, where I've been for a little over 10 years. So I do understand very much a large urban district, and then I also understand the issues that might come up in a non-urban district. And we were at Tyler, we had 10 sports, and we had dormitories and food service, so that was a highly complex operation. Austin's a very simple operation. When I got down here, I said, "You mean all the students come here and go to school and go home and that's it?" And they said, "Yeah, that's pretty much it." And I said, "Well, this shouldn't be a problem." But I was scared to death coming down here just because it's a much larger district and it was in Austin. But I found that there's not that much difference between a smaller district, smaller budget, and a larger budget. It's just kind of the zeros after it. So I've tried to put something that will apply to, regardless of which size district you're from, something that would go through the institution level budgeting process, kind of where, and this is from my experiences at Austin Community College, but they're quite similar to what we did at Tyler Junior College. I also have a master's degree in college student development, and I'm working on a doctorate right now at UT Austin. But I'm pretty proud of that community college degree from Colorado, because it's a technical degree in gunsmithing. And I did earn my degree there, although the college didn't get any credit for it. I wasn't first time in college. So, but it was a great experience, and I think I have a good feel for, the operational aspects of a community college that have served me well for a long time. The general budget development strategy, and I say that strategy on purpose, is because you don't just go in and add up the revenues and add up the expenses and put them together and see how things are going to turn out. But you want to think about long term. You want to think about all the things that are not only happening now, but that could happen, and kind of buffer your budget. Keep it on the conservative side, so there's something unforeseen that's happened of significance that you haven't got over exuberant on the revenue side, and now your budget's in trouble. But kind of keep your budget positioned to weather some storms, not the perfect storm, but some storms. The first thing we do is we have a master plan. I believe the Southern Association, the accreditation requires that you have something. We do one, and we update it every year, and it's sort of the precursor to the budget process. We want to be sure we have a plan in place, and we have some idea of what we think we're going to be doing from now and into the future, and then we build the budget around that. Now, you have day-to-day operational things that you do all year, every year, but then you have some new initiatives or something you need to do at your school, and you want to have that thought through and then link to your budget process. Say, okay, how are we going to do that? Because that'll come in handy, when you start saying how we're going to pay for it. So we have a master plan. It's developed by the president and the staff. It could, talk about the district educational needs in your area. What state initiatives, closing the gap, outcome-based funding, the things you've been hearing about, think about those things. How would they affect you? And then your capital needs, your buildings, basically. If your district's expanding, then you'll need to be thinking about that. And we'll have a separate little small section on capital budgeting, but how's that all going to play in operating costs in the future? If your area is not growing, then you still have to take care of what you got, and this gets real critical in that respect too. We have a supporting budget is developed by the president and the staff to the master plan, and it all goes to the board over a several-month period we'll talk about, but the board approves the master plan and then approves the budget, usually at the same meeting. So trustees get a good rundown on what the master plan initiatives are and how they've been updated and how we did in the past, and then the budget to support those is presented and approved or not. I would definitely think long range, especially these days. We prepare a long-term revenue and expense estimates for our main sources of revenues. And I think in a later session, you'll get deeper into the how the state level budgeting works and how it affects us. But state appropriations is the wiggly one that is difficult to predict, or the most difficult to predict. And so we pay a lot of attention to what's going on down there and look at the state situation and what's affecting them. We certainly look at our district taxes, what the valuations in our district are, which direction they're heading, trying to get clues as to what the future is going to bring to us so that we can put reasonable estimates into our budget. Tuition and fees, we look at that. That's your third source. Where are they? Do we think they're high? Are we, how averse are, I think everybody wants to keep them low, but are we just like, is it an absolute no tuition and fees this year, or are we going to have a nice budget process and then make that decision? Those are all things to keep in mind, and then we look at the cost side. Say what, and make our best guess. We use a lot of history. What are we doing this year? What did we do the year before? And the new budget needs to be linked to that pretty tightly so you don't forget something. In my experience, I've seen a couple occasions where a wrong number was put in. If it had been checked against what had been done in the past, it has saved a lot of trouble. And then look at your capital needs, because those eventually work their way into the operating budget. Here's some questions trustees and certainly the staff ask or should ask when you're talking about it. What's going on with the national economy? What's going on with the state economy? In 2008, perfect example, in the summer things started going, downhill really, really quickly. And we sat down and said, we don't know where this is going to end. What should we start doing today at our college to prepare for things that might happen? Because when the economy goes south and the state people stop buying things, that's going to hit state sales tax immediately. And then your appropriations is going to affect it, later on long term, your tax valuations, what's going on out there and how is that going to hit us? It could be positive, it could be negative, but the quicker you can get on a budget problem or start asking questions about it, the better. Right now, Medicaid, people say that have been in this a long time at every level, say Medicaid's killing public education. Because a lot of times our budget line at the state is discretionary, but there's a whole lot of legally mandated things that your state must cover. And if you're the discretionary part, then that problem's coming and budget accordingly. What's our appraised value? We had in '09, we had some of these tall buildings downtown suddenly say, we're not sure we can make our tax payment, our property tax payment. And all of a sudden, yeah, I know. You think, whoa, what is that? And it's about $850,000. Well, that's close to me. It's starting to run into some money, okay. So this year, we may not know until January whether we're getting $1 million or so. That could be pretty scary. What are we going to do about that? What's our plan if that happens? Financial aid, that is a huge element of how your students pay your tuition. And so when they start making changes to what's eligible for Pell financing, for example, it could, and I think it actually has this year, easily showed up in pretty good sized numbers on students who could take courses before and Pell would cover it. Now Pell doesn't cover those courses if they're not leading to a degree, or if you just took one course, things like that. That's going to show up in your revenue line probably unexpectedly because you don't really know how that's going to affect. And what's the political climate? Are we willing to raise taxes to cover all these things? Probably not. So, in other words, you're going to be taking it locally when you might have used to gotten that paid for by the state. This is an analysis we run on contact hour funding that the state of Texas. And we actually took this to our board when we were having tuition discussions and said, look, we really need to understand and have a policy locally on how we're going to deal with reductions in state funding. I mean, it's not good or bad, it just is. So we need to think about our other sources of revenue, district taxes and tuition and fees differently and very objectively, because if you can see, this starts in 2000 over here, and we have the actuals up to about now, and then we said, okay, here's the nominal funding, this is the actual dollars, but if you adjust those by inflation, the state, it funds growth kind of, but not always, but it never funds inflation. We don't even ask for it as community colleges. So it's about 3.5% average a year. Then your purchasing power is that blue line with inflation alone, and then the red one is growth funding and inflation that we don't get. When we get a lot more students, but the appropriations aren't enough to cover those new students, then that's your actual inflation-adjusted state appropriations stretched out to about 2030. So right now we're about 20-something% at our college, but we're thinking, okay, this is about $52 million to us right now. By 2030, how do we live without it? Because when it gets to that point, it's going to be like a discretionary fund. And just a business officer here, I was just saying, if that happens, and the trend certainly looks like it may well be for lots of reasons, then we need to think about how we do business. You know, is what we're doing today sustainable? These are our revenue and expense lines. I split them a little. I mean, look at those like they're supposed to equal if you have a balanced budget. I split them so you could just see them. And these are our revenues. You add these three, state and tuition fees and taxes together, they should equal that. And so we chart out and say, here's your state appropriations in real dollars, you know, not considering inflation. And so that's what this will do, that to our tuition and fees and taxes. Our tax rate's actually capped now at our district. We have to go to the voters to get it raised. It's 9 cents per 100. So we don't really have that latitude, but you know, we have to talk about it. And then tuition and fees would add up to that, and is that really going to work over the next 20 or 30 years? So that's an example of how we look at long-range trends on the revenue side. We also actually showed this to the board, that this is the average two-year college tuition and fees in the United States. We have New Hampshire over here, and we got Texas way down here at a third from the bottom. In other words, our tuition and fee average at community colleges in Texas is very, very low compared to the United States. The average is right there. Here's New Mexico and California. Last year, we were second only to California, who heavily subsidizes their tuition. But still, there's a lot of latitude in our tuition and fee rates as compared to even the national average, and the legislature knows this. So they say you have a lot of upside potential before you're even at the national average. The universities, by the way, have come up, they're about the national average now in Texas. This example, when appropriation bill comes out early in the legislative session, you get all the information you can, and your business office does analysis and say, okay, here's what we have now, here's what's proposed, here's the differences, and what kind of reductions we're looking at. And then we throw this in there kind of to stir controversy about what it would be under if we expected instruction to be funded. We don't really expect that, but we want to see what it looks like. Actually, in the formula appropriation stayed pretty close to the same, maybe went up a little bit. If you look in the Chronicle, Texas is 2 or 3%. But what did happen is this appropriation for group insurance went way down, and which means that's passed on to the local college. Now that's in your budget. It was in the state budget. And that's about the third time in my career that that's happened. When there's a cut, they cut the benefits and leave the appropriation. The net effect in your shop, at your school, is you just picked up another expense for group insurance benefits. So a review of the components is you have we didn't do extensive master planning in Tyler because the area was not growing that fast. We had some facilities needs. but we did do a pretty thorough facilities master plan because we knew we had some expansion, but it was mostly directed towards facilities. At Austin CC, we just spent a lot more time looking at academic things. We have new annexation areas coming in. They're expecting different programs. How do we deal with that? So we pay a lot more detailed attention to what we're doing on the academic side and roll it into the master plan. That does two things. One, it gives you an idea of what you want to do or what you need to do, but it also keeps a lot of ad hoc stuff from coming from multiple directions. They say, hey, why don't we do this? And if you kind of jump on everything that comes along, it creates a lot of uncertainty, whereas if you have a good master planning process supported by the board and the staff, they say, okay, work that into the master plan. We'll talk about that when we look at the master plan. If it sounds like a great idea, we'll work it in there. And that way you can say, okay, what are the future operating, what's this really going to cost us now and in the future? So it's kind of important to have, we have budget planning assumptions and directives at the beginning of each budget process, like about now. The board officers or the board and the president get together and get a general agreement on, okay, in the next budget, what's going to be our priorities. Of course, it's going to depend on the district, but it's good to have the board and the president come up with some, usually directives the president will put together, but then discuss with the board. And then those go out to us in the departments and say, okay, here's the college's priorities in your budget planning for the coming year. So we don't need these long lists of disparate things from your department. We want to know how you're going to support these initiatives in your area. And so it saves a lot of time, it makes the situation a lot more efficient. And then we have the departmental budget requests. We actually turn the budget system on. We want the budget built by the departments. They have operating costs that they know best about. And then there's the planning directives of the initiatives we would like for them to say how will that cost us if your area is asked to do something different or expand. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but these are the three. You have a master plan, you have some guidance from the president and the trustees on where the direction of the college, and then you have the departments put together a budget that supports that. The other way you can do it is go and say, hey, everybody go do some planning in your department, and we'll have a long list of priorities and we'll sift amongst them and decide what we're going to do. Then you have this everybody, one, feels obligated to show they really are thinking and want to do something new and different. I mean, you wouldn't want to hand in a blank sheet of paper, and it gives you hundreds of things that someone has to prioritize and tell a bunch of people no, when usually you had an idea of what you wanted to do anyway. Again, number one's master plan. We do a 3-year rolling plan that's updated annually. We don't start over. We update the one we have, and it tracks and prioritizes major initiatives, focus on defined strategic goals. Those, I've already covered this, planning and assumptions. We tried it several other ways. This has worked by far the best, to have general guidelines of what we want to do. And gets us started on the budget earlier because we have a heads up. We want departmental, we want them to request, this is really important because usually I've seen two major problems in an institutional budget that stem from a budget error in adjunct faculty, or some, where they just didn't, but the number just wasn't big enough. And it was an oversight because it was not a bottom-up process, whereas the departments, they would have known that. It would have never happened. And so we asked them, budget for your area and let those bubble up through the system, and it'll be looked at. But it's a way to protect the college from unforeseen errors in large budget lines. And you get a lot of good ideas from the departments. They say, hey, we need this or we need that, and a lot of good conversations from people who are actually on the front line. Those are reviewed. We have the departments and a department chair, and then you're going to have a dean, and then you're going to have vice presidents in various areas of the college. But what the departments produce is reviewed by the dean in that area and then up to the VP of instruction or what other area you're talking about. Instruction's usually the largest one because that's your faculty salaries are there, which is usually the largest component of your budget. But that's how it's prioritized, because if you can't do everything, but I'm comfortable as a business officer, and I sort of the extension of the president and actually putting the budget belongs to the president. He submits it to the board. I'm the extension of the president that goes out and actually does those things. My staff and I to put a budget together and bring it to the president for discussion, and then take it to the board, who approves it or not. So you want to do a good job. We don't want to get to the board and we forgot something. So, and also by doing that, when it does get to the high level and the board, this is when you're, okay, if it's not balanced, then it never is. The expense requests, things you think you need to do, are going to be more than your revenues, most likely. And that's where the things the board must approve come into play. If you say, what do we do? Do we raise tuition to cover this? Do we raise taxes to cover this? Some combination of both if you have tax room. Or do we hold the line and say, no, we're not going to do that this year? Or let's look at the expense side, which is say we want to cut the budget enough to provide new funds or to hold the line, or we don't want to raise revenues. That gets real tricky right there because there's I'd say typically there's not a whole lot on the expense side. You can cut travel, you can cut, but they're going to be very small in compared to your personnel budget. So if you're going to get big time dollars out of your expense side budget that are actually going to move some needles, then you're talking personnel basically, or programs, things of that nature. We summarized it's summarized and presented to the board for discussion. We actually present it in cumulative phases starting in March. We say, let's have a talk about, let me go, there's the calendar. In March, this is for the 12 budget, we bring the process calendar to the board, the planning directives, we go over those again for review, and then give an overview of where we think the budget is at that time, particularly with the revenue side of it. About every other year, you're planning a budget when you don't know what your appropriations are going to be, and your district taxes are not certified until late July. So there's some unknowns there, but it gives everybody a good chance to start looking at your budget at every level and having budget discussions. We go back in April and we focus in on revenues, expenses, and tuition and fees, because if we do take some tuition and fee action, the board will need to do that in May so it can get into the data system so that your fall early enrollments will be charged that and you won't lose those funds. You can't charge students something and then charge them a little more if you decide to raise fees. In fact, they passed a law against that several years ago, right after we did it at Tyler. But I don't know if we caused it, but the timing was interesting. But anyway, you want to get that in and all set before you start your early fall registration, or say we'll make this effective in the spring, and no, we're not going to get that money in the fall. Then we do several budget studies here where we bring it back to the board. It's also the public. We're not required to have public forums and things like that. We use our board meetings, though, if anybody has any issues, and also we have employee groups, that, they want raises. Gives everyone an opportunity to come talk about the budget, have a discussion about it, talk about it in components. I mean, to see the whole thing, but talk about specific components and provide time for that. And then in June, we have a technology discussion about the budget, all the needs, technology for the district, what are those going to be, how did we arrive at them, what kind of things, if you want to replace servers and a vehicle fleet, a couple of cars, things like that, what the priorities are, and what we're going to buy with the money that we've asked for in the technology budget. And then compensation and benefits, that's usually a big one at our college, where everyone gets to come forth and discuss with the board why they should have a far bigger raise than has actually been proposed for them. But that's also when the board says, okay, it's a 2%, 3%, 4%, whatever raise that's going to be approved. That's set. And then on July 5th, later we do the master plan and a budget study one more time, and then in July 5th, both are approved, and that's going to be the budget for the year. Some schools do it later. I actually would like it a little later, since you don't know your taxes till the end of July, and the later you go, the more accurate your budget people can be with the budget. They'll know more. Legislature's over, you've worked it in. But also it's nice in July to be done with it, because it's generally pretty close anyway. So that's our budget calendar. I'm sure, like I say, some schools push it into September. Yes. Well, you usually see the clouds gathering, so you have some indication that it's not going to be a surprise, and that's you ask those questions. Do we go back? How are we going to cover that? Do we go ask everybody to, or some people, whether it's selective or general, to trim their budgets by X%? Or I think we've had a couple of mid-year cuts in the last several years. And usually we have a plan to say, okay, if that happens, or if we have an appropriation surprise, we're going to look to facilities budget, because it's a decent budget. It's based on depreciation, and say, okay, that's our go-to to put brakes on there and preserve what we do in instruction that directly affects students. We're going to preserve that at all costs. And that's actually what we did. And so we go to the facilities side and to slam the brakes on. This is your new budget. Of course, that's hard on them, but say that's just how we're going to do it at our school. We don't like across-the-board stuff.
Yeah, with the large cut in healthcare, is that already in your March budget, or are you waiting to find out what the final cuts are?
You usually have a pretty good idea of that, and yeah, as soon as we learn something, we stick it in the budget, which is one reason it's good to have multiple sessions, because it changes a lot from, say, March through the end of it. But when we see that this is the talk, and then we'll do scenarios and say, if this happens, here's the budget. Just various plans of what we plan to do. And it may go into the next year and say, okay, if this happened, we're going to increase section size, or something unpopular, but that will also generate some budget, hopefully generate some budget effect that you can deal with it over the next year. Because you have a whole year, so you can say, well, we'll add a couple bucks or $5 in tuition for the spring, and that'll solve this problem. We found our state cuts are typically average. So if they say 7%, it's going to really be 7% for us. At other schools, a larger percent of their budget is state appropriations. It could have a dramatic effect. So it's kind of tricky, especially when it's going to be pretty unpredictable. But this is just don't try to read this, but the way we present this to our trustees. When we present things to the board, we want to answer most of their questions on the page if possible, and so we can just point to it, and then they can see it and see how it fits in. We've got over here, we've got the current budget, and this is actually a tuition, what we've done with tuition. So they can see it right there. Here's your tuitions, here's what it was, here's what's proposed, here's the increases. What percent change and when it's effective. They can see that right away. Here's what we've talked about, or here's what we're proposing, and here's the ramifications to the students and the budget. And then we work those into the projected, these are all revenue lines. This is tuition and fees. These are all the, the state appropriations, district taxes, things of that nature. Again, we put it in context. Here's our current budget that you approved last year. Here's what we think next year's what we're proposing at the time, whether it went up or down, by how much percent. And then there's notes in here as to, okay, what we said, here's the comments about it, why we put that in there. And I think most of it, we send these things out in the agenda earlier, so there are a lot of questions that can be ready to talk about it at the board meeting, and we have some guide for the public so we could say, here's what we're doing and why we're doing it and what our assumptions are. This is the expense budget table. Same intent here. We do it by function. So we've got student services, library services, as opposed to a general salaries, expenses. It breaks the college down where you trustees can see the things we do in the college and what the current budget is, and then what's changed. We might have, so here's 2 new campuses coming on or starting to come on. And this shows, 1, we thought about it, but 2, how much it is. And it's in the budget, so we don't have to worry about it. Yes, we did think of that, and here's how much it is. And then we get down here and debt service, benefits, things of that nature. But anyway, everyone can see that here's what we do. Yes, we did think about it. Here's what we put in for it, and here's the new bottom line and all the changes. So it's very open, and it's a good way to discuss the budget. Here's our long-range thing. This is very important too, probably the most important. This goes out to 2021 because we run out of paper. But we can take this out indefinitely, literally, and we do. But this is our revenue estimations based on what we know now. We're a very policy-driven college. We have an excellent set, a concise set of board policies, and the policies cover every aspect of the college, including budgeting and finance and facilities. So and it's policy level, so you need to provide an adequate financing for thus and such. And so we put it in terms of policy here, but then we put it each year in the compounding and what goes on with that, what it's going to look like 10 or 11 years from now. And then down here we show in terms of tuition, you can do other things, but we show, okay, your revenue estimates and the policies that you've approved and want us to follow are going to have this effect, and this is what, in terms of tuition, it will require to carry those policies out, given that the other district taxes and appropriations. And what that says there is about $5 a year in district tuition, and some more, maybe 20 in out-of-district tuition over time. And yes, your policies and your revenues and your expenses, those will be sustainable into the future if you do this. If you don't do that, there's going to be problems if some estimate changes, but we'll dial those in and deal with them. But right now, you have a long-range, economically sustainable fiscal plan for your district. And it's a great way to kind of see problems coming. When I first started at ACC, the first 2 or 3 years looked great. The 4th year had about a $20 million deficit in it. And I said, wow, so the benefit of carrying those out, particularly your things such as a new campus coming online, but mostly your payroll. If you give a 4% raise, you have to pay for that forever. And it's going to compound each year as you give raises. It just does, and it's usually a very large percent of your budget. So you want to see how that's affecting things on into the future if you do 4%, no percent, 5%. But those compound. And you buy a piece of equipment, you don't buy it again next year. You give a raise, it's going to roll forever. So the revenues to take care of that also have to grow forever. Not forever, but you know what I mean. Capital budgeting. This is separate. It's not me, is it? We do this separately, but it links into the operating budget through debt service. and and also operating expenses. That long-range plan, if we know we've got a campus facilities master plan, we will estimate the operations cost of that new facility or new campus and put it in the longer-term budget so you can see the effect of it down the road, which is handy, and say, okay, and I think even if you don't have your facilities master plan, and we've done those, they do a facility condition audit where they come in and make an assessment of here's the buildings you have, here's the components, your air conditioning is going to run out in building so-and-so 10 years from now, and you'll have to replace it, or all the roofs, or all that stuff. And they'll give you an index for each building and a cost associated with it. So you've got this train coming in facilities costs, but it's 10 years out, and you can do something about that, how you plan to work that into what you're doing now. We actually used that and said, okay, if we make the buildings and grounds budget this much, then we can pay cash for all that and handle it as we get there, or have enough in the bank to take care of it when it gets there. We don't have to issue debt. The board thought that was a great idea, and we've actually put that on a cash basis, knowing that if the state has a big drop, that's also our go-to for how to cover the budget that year. Your capital, your large-scale capital expenses, buildings, major renovations, usually you have two main options to finance those if you can't pay cash. If you got cash, that's the best, although it actually does have problems. But the board has a revenue bond. In other words, if you have the money to pay the debt, all the board has to do is approve those. Yeah, you need the cash, and you need to know how you're going to pay for it, but you don't have to ask anybody. The board can sit down and say, we're going to approve revenue bonds for these capital purposes, and you just sell them. Your other, and by far the best option is this general obligation bond. You go to the public and say, we need you to approve, $100 million in bonds, and this is what we're going to do with it. It's just like a school district does, and please vote yourself a tax to pay this debt off. Never hit your operating budget that way as far as debt service goes. It's ideal, but you do have to have an election, which you may or may not be able to pass. There are several other options, and they're usually a derivative of revenue bonds, where you go out and issue some kind of debt based on some kind of revenue stream that you have coming in. Our last deal is, here's some questions put together for if you're a new trustee and you sit down and you're hearing these budget presentations from guys like me and the president, say, well, what are the board's budget policies? Do we have some? What do they say? You'll usually have those in hand as a new trustee, but read those carefully, because if they're driving the budget, there's some things in there that you may want to know more about. We had some policies at ACC when I started that basically would go in and just rake off anything new, devote it to that purpose, and it was a board policy. We had to put the budget together, so we went and said, hey, look, this is doing this. I don't think that's really what you want. You're right. And so the policy was changed after discussions with the board, but we don't do things that are against board policy. Do we have a master plan, including facilities? I think this is really important. If ideally an academic master plan, but certainly a facilities plan, because usually the districts you see just implode for financial reasons is almost always facilities related, and not day-to-day stuff. I'm not talking about the custodial. I'm talking when they get into a building project or something comes up they need to do there, and there's some estimations that weren't right, or costs got out of hand. But so that's really a critical plan, and to watch very, very closely is what's going on with facilities, because a mistake there in the English department, a mistake in facilities is usually tens of millions of dollars, and it can take you down pretty quick. How often is the master plan updated, and is the budget tied to the master plan? These are good policies. These probably ought to be addressed in board policies at some point, and then check on them each year in the budget process. And how does our budget, is it built from the bottom up, departments up? I think that's good. It protects me because there's people that know what they're doing that build that budget. I have a far higher level of confidence in the numbers coming up. We cross-check them and things against history, but those are the people that really know what they're doing. Top down, I've seen budgets where the business officer goes in shuts his door, comes out with a budget. Twice I've seen catastrophic errors in it over the years, wouldn't me? But it's easy to do that. So an open bottom-up process is very healthy and protects the district. And what are the long-range implications? You know, we're annexing, we're building campuses, we're out beating the drum, doing things in our district. I think some of the districts are looking over out into the service area and building campuses. You know, how's that going to play out over operating expenses, things in the future? And that you're thinking about that and have a plan to take care of that. And our present practices fiscally sustainable. That chart with everything going through the roof I showed earlier, there's a point in there when the revenues, you know, we say, is that level of tuition sustainable? Or do we really want to charge our students that? And if the answer is no, better look to the cost side and say, you know, what are we going to do? How we do business differently to slow that down? You usually never stop it, but you're doing really well budgeting if you can slow down the increase in expenses, because you got, you know, electric bills, you got inflation, things of that. But if you can just slow them down a lot, then that's huge savings over time. So I wish you the best of luck. It's interesting times. So, yes, sir.
The general feeling is that the revenue from the state is going to decrease. If the economy of the state improves, is that a reversible thing, or
Yes, in theory it should be, but I guess what concerns us is that the Medicaid, their mandated expenses such as Medicaid, things that are rising faster, and that's going to possibly we will get more money, but it's not going to fund our growth and our inflation. Likely it never has really. But if that's growing faster and faster, then the new funds will go to those type purposes and not come to us. You know, you go down to the Capitol and say, you know, and they'll lean over the dais and say, there's people going to die if they don't get budget money. You community colleges, you know, is it important for you to have more money, or is it important for these people to live, you know, and get medical services? And so this is the thing we're dealing with. And you say, well, yeah, okay. But it could. But it typically, this is a good point, typically they'll rise in good times, drop in bad times, and then spend the next 5 or 6 years rising, and they may get to the level they were back 5 or 6 years ago, and then the periodic cycle, boom, now you're down. And that's why the trend goes this way, is you spend years getting back to where you were 5 or 6 years ago. And those cycles happen in any state. It's happening all over the country, too. It's not just here. About every 10 years, you're going to have a downturn in the state economy that's going to affect your appropriations. Yes, sir.
question about the mechanics and how you do this. Early on, you suggested that the president and officers of the trustees sit down and develop a master plan. And then later on, it comes to the entire board. Do you have a budget committee, or do the officers that are on the executive committee have input into this? And about how many man hours of board time do you think all these steps would consume?
Well, the master plan itself is not something that the board actually does. The president and the staff conduct, because it takes many, many man hours. They put that together. The part that the board, and in our board, it could be a committee of the entire board, and it's really kind of up to the board. If the board says, we're going to let the board officers work with the president, come up with it, and then you tell us what you came up with, so the whole board knows. We do not have board committees at our college of any kind. It's always a committee of the whole. However, they do say, okay, let's do some planning and directives. We know we're going to talk about it at several public meetings where everybody's there. So, but just for the interest of time, here's the budget assumptions and directives that we would like to see the college working on in their process. So it connects the board, but doesn't take too much of their time. Thank you very much.